I suspected my wife was planning a divorce, so I moved my assets. 2 weeks later, she filed and claimed it was all a joke when her plan backfired. Hey everyone, like and subscribe for more. And before we jump in, I've been lurking through posts here for a while, always thinking I'd never have my own story to share. But life has a way of surprising you, and I've been carrying this around for months. I need to let it out. Let me just say up front, I've never been the type to jump to conclusions or assume the worst. My wife, let's just call her M, and I have been together for 6 years, married for 4. Things were solid, or so I thought. We had the usual ups and downs, sure, but nothing that made me think, oh, there's trouble here. In fact, for most of our relationship, we were that couple, teammates through and through. We laughed at dumb inside jokes, debated for hours over which movie to watch, and had this rhythm that just worked. She'd plan elaborate date nights, and I'd surprise her with her favorite takeout after a long day. It felt effortless, like we'd figured out this whole love thing. That's why what happened next hit me like a ton of bricks. About 6 months ago, things started to shift. At first, it was little things, stuff you'd probably miss if you weren't paying attention. She started taking her phone everywhere, even if she was just going to the kitchen or folding laundry. Before this, her phone would just sit on the coffee table for hours, and she didn't care who picked it up. I made a joke one day saying, "What are you running some secret spy ring now?" She laughed it off and said, "No, work's been emailing me a lot." Okay, fine. But then a couple of days later, she set up a password. That one caught me off guard because she'd never used one before. I casually asked her why, and she said something vague about security and hackers. I didn't push it because I didn't want to sound paranoid, but something about it just felt off. It didn't stop there. She started stepping out of the room to take calls, something she never used to do. It wasn't subtle either. Her phone would ring and she'd be like, "Oh, let me just grab this real quick," and disappear into the bedroom or out onto the porch. If I asked who it was, she'd just say, "Just a friend from work." Then there was this habit she picked up of keeping her phone face down on the table. I didn't even realize it was a thing until one day I reached over to hand her something, and she quickly moved her phone out of the way. It was one of those blink and you'll miss it moments, but it stuck with me. It wasn't just the phone stuff, though. She started feeling distant. Conversations that used to flow naturally now felt like I was pulling teeth. If I brought up future plans, like where should we go for our anniversary, or do you think we should start saving for a new car, she'd just nod and say, "Yeah, we'll see," before changing the subject. The day it all really clicked for me was this one random Wednesday. She told me she was meeting a friend for coffee after work. It didn't sound weird, she does that sometimes. I happened to be running errands in the same area and thought, hey, why not surprise her? It'd be cute. When I got there though, she wasn't with her friend. She was outside the cafe, pacing back and forth with her phone pressed to her ear. I stayed in my car because something about the way she was talking felt serious. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but I caught snippets like, "It's almost ready and starting fresh soon." My stomach dropped. I couldn't figure out what she meant, but it didn't sound like work stuff or friend drama. It sounded bigger than that, like something she'd been planning. When she got home later, I asked her how her coffee date went, trying to keep my tone normal. She gave me this whole story about her friend, venting about her boyfriend's latest screw-up. She went on about how she was giving advice and being a good listener. I nodded along, pretending to believe her, but my brain was working overtime. Was I reading too much into this? Overthinking? Or was there something deeper going on? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something she wasn't telling me. Things carried on like that for a few more days. I started watching her behavior more closely, not because I wanted to catch her in something, but because I needed to make sense of what I'd seen and heard. She wasn't acting suspicious in any big obvious way, but it was the little things that didn't sit right. And then out of nowhere, she brought up our finances. We were having dinner one night, just a normal weekday meal, chatting about random stuff, her work, a new show she wanted to watch, when she suddenly said, "You know, we should really organize all our financial stuff." She flashed her most innocent smile. It was such a left field comment that I just stared at her for a second. "What do you mean?" I asked. She shrugged. "I just think we should have everything in one place, you know? Like all our account info, passwords, documents, that kind of thing, just in case of emergency." I didn't know what to say. This wasn't something we'd ever talked about before, and the timing felt weird considering everything else. "What kind of emergencies?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. She shrugged again. "It's just smart, isn't it? What if something happens to one of us? Or what if we need to make a big financial decision quickly?" Her explanation made sense, on the surface, but something about the way she said it put me on edge. It was too rehearsed, too neat, like she'd been waiting for the right moment to bring it up. I nodded and mumbled something like, Yeah, I guess that's a good idea, but inside, alarm bells were going off. Why now? Why suddenly care about organizing our finances when we'd always kept things separate and loose? That night, my mind kept replaying her comment over and over, trying to piece together what it could mean. Was this just normal adult stuff, and I was reading too much into it? But then I thought about the phone calls, the conversation I'd overheard at the cafe, and how distant she'd been lately. It all started to add up, and I didn't like the picture it was painting. Until then, I didn't do anything about it. A couple of days later, she brought it up again. We were in the kitchen, I was making a sandwich, and she was scrolling on her phone, when she suddenly said, "Have you thought more about organizing the bank stuff? Like, do you know where all the account details are?" I put down the knife and turned to face her. "Okay, what's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light but firm. "You've been bringing up the finances a lot lately. Is there something we need to talk about?" She finally looked up from her phone, surprised, like she didn't expect me to press her on it. "No, nothing's wrong," she said quickly, giving me a small laugh. "I just think it's important, that's all. You know, for emergencies." "Emergencies like what?" She shrugged, her face unreadable. "I don't know, just life stuff. It's not a big deal, I promise. I just think it's something we should get on top of." Her answer felt vague. Too vague. I nodded and let it go, but the way she avoided giving a straight answer only made me more suspicious. It didn't feel like a casual suggestion anymore. It felt like she was hiding something, and I had no idea what it was. The next day, while she was at work, I decided to take a closer look at our financial situation. I logged into our joint account and noticed something strange. Small transfers had been made over the past month. Nothing huge, just little amounts that didn't seem to have a clear purpose. They weren't labeled for bills or groceries or anything obvious. At first I thought maybe I was just being paranoid, but as I kept looking, something didn't sit right. It looked like she was slowly moving money out of our account for something. I debated confronting her about it, but something told me to wait. If I was wrong, I'd look like an idiot. If I was right, well, I needed to be careful. It was eating me up inside, so I reached out to someone I trusted, an old college buddy who happens to be a lawyer. I explained what was happening, trying not to sound like a paranoid conspiracy theorist. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment before saying, "I'm not saying something's definitely going on, but you're not crazy for wanting to be prepared. If you're worried about protecting your assets, now's the time to do it. Better safe than sorry." He gave me a rundown of what I could do, simple steps to make sure my finances were secure if something was happening. I'll admit, the idea of taking action like that felt extreme. It felt like I was planning for something terrible when I wasn't even sure anything was wrong. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. If she was up to something, and I was starting to believe she was, I needed to protect myself. It wasn't an easy decision, though. This wasn't just about money or assets. This was about the life we'd built together. I kept replaying memories in my head, our wedding day, the times we stayed up late talking about our dreams, the random little jokes we shared. How did we get here? Was this really what our marriage had come to? The thought of taking these steps felt like admitting defeat, like I was officially giving up on the trust we once had. That evening, while she was out, I sat down at my desk and pulled out my laptop. My hands were shaking as I opened the browser and started going through everything. Bank accounts, investment accounts, the house deed. Each document I reviewed felt like a betrayal. But the nagging voice in my head kept reminding me that this was about survival, not sabotage. I wasn't trying to hurt her. I just couldn't shake the feeling that if I didn't act now, I'd regret it later. I made a list of everything I could transfer and how to do it without raising suspicion. As I typed, I felt this crushing weight settle on my chest. I'd trusted her completely for years, and now here I was, playing defense against the person I thought would always have my back. Then I called my mom. I didn't tell her everything, just enough to explain why I needed her help. "I need you to hold on to some things for me for a while. It's nothing bad, just something I need to do to protect myself, just in case." She was quiet for a moment, probably trying to figure out what I wasn't saying. "Are you okay?" Her voice was full of concern. "Yeah," I lied. "It's just a precaution, nothing to worry about." She didn't press me, but I could hear the hesitation in her voice when she said, "Of course, sweetheart, whatever you need." Hanging up the phone, I felt a strange mix of relief and shame. I hated involving her in this mess, but at the same time, knowing she had my back gave me some sense of stability in a situation that felt like quicksand. By the time Em got home, I'd already started the process. I transferred most of my assets, our savings, my investments, even the house, into my mom's name. I left enough in our joint account to keep up appearances, but the rest was locked down. She didn't notice a thing. She came in, kissed me on the cheek, and asked if I wanted to watch a movie. I acted normal, but inside I was a mess. Part of me felt guilty, like I was betraying her trust, but another part of me felt relieved, like I was finally taking control of a situation that had been spiraling out of my hands. Over the next few days, I kept things as normal as possible. I didn't want to tip her off that anything had changed. She seemed content, even unusually cheerful at times, but instead of putting me at ease, it made me more suspicious. If she was planning something, she was doing an expert job of hiding it. What stood out, though, was that she didn't bring up the finances again. Not once. After I questioned her the last time, it was like the subject had completely vanished from her mind. At first, I thought maybe I'd overreacted, and she dropped it because it really wasn't that important. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like she was avoiding it. Almost like she was dreading bringing it up again after I pressed her. I caught her glancing at me a few times, though. Quick little looks, like she was gauging my mood or deciding whether to say something. Every time I noticed, she'd immediately turn her attention back to whatever she was doing. Her phone, the TV, a book. It was subtle, but it was there. It felt like she was waiting for me to bring it up, like she didn't want to risk pushing the topic again. The silence about it only made me more uneasy. It wasn't like her to just drop something she thought was important, and the way she avoided it now felt deliberate. If she was testing the waters, she wasn't getting in. And if she was waiting for something, I wasn't about to give her the green light. Whatever her next move was, I knew I needed to stay one step ahead. Something was coming. I just didn't know when or how. All I could do was prepare. That night, I made sure everything was solid. I went over the paperwork again, double-checking every detail of the asset transfers to my mom. The house, the savings, the investments, everything was legally in her name now, locked in a trust that couldn't be contested. I even called her to confirm she had all the documentation on her end. 2 weeks went by, and things seemed normal. Too normal, actually. She was acting more affectionate, even initiating conversations about random stuff, like work or what we should eat for dinner. It threw me off because for months she'd been distant, avoiding anything deeper than surface-level talk. Part of me started to wonder if I'd been overreacting all along. Maybe the weird behavior was just stress or something I couldn't understand. But then, on a random Friday night, she sat me down on the couch, turned off the TV and said, "We need to talk." My stomach immediately dropped. I knew what was coming before she even said it. "I think we should get a divorce," she said, her tone so calm it felt rehearsed. It wasn't angry, and it wasn't emotional. It was just cold, like she was telling me we'd run out of milk. I stared at her, unsure how to respond, as she launched into her reasoning. She talked about needing space, wanting to figure herself out, feeling like she'd lost her identity in the marriage. Standard breakup lines that didn't actually explain anything. But then she said something that hit differently. "You know, I've made a lot of sacrifices for you over the years, and I don't think you really appreciate them. I deserve more." That last part stung. It wasn't just about her wanting out. It was about her framing this like I owed her something. Like all of this was my fault, and she was just claiming what was rightfully hers. I sat there, trying to process what she was saying, but a new question kept bubbling to the surface. Why now? Then she dropped a line that made everything start to click. "A friend of mine has been helping me see things more clearly," she said, not meeting my eyes. A friend. I stayed quiet, letting her talk, but my mind was racing. Who was this friend? Why were they involved in my marriage? The way she said it wasn't casual. It sounded like someone had been hyping her up, convincing her that leaving me wasn't just an option, but some kind of strategy she needed to execute. And the more she talked about how she deserved more because of her sacrifices, the more I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Sacrifices? What sacrifices? She had been happy with me, or at least that's what she always said. I'd worked hard to give her the life she wanted, and I wasn't just talking about money. When she wanted to move closer to her job, I agreed, even though it meant a longer commute for me. When she wanted to take that expensive yoga retreat last year, I made sure we budgeted for it, even skipping a vacation I'd been looking forward to so she could go. I supported her when she switched careers. Twice. Telling her it was okay to take the leap because I wanted her to be happy. I thought being a good husband meant putting her first whenever I could. And it wasn't like I was some inattentive, distant partner. I showed up. I remembered anniversaries and random little things she mentioned liking. I planned date nights when she said she was feeling stuck in a rut. I listened to her vent about work, her friends, her family. I didn't always get it right, but I always tried. That's what made her "I deserve more" line sting so much. I didn't buy it, not for a second. She wasn't unhappy because of anything I did or didn't do. She was unhappy because something had changed in her. Maybe it was this friend. She kept bringing up maybe it was something else. But the person sitting in front of me now wasn't the woman I married, and I wasn't going to let her rewrite the story of our marriage to suit her new narrative. I didn't press her in the moment. Instead, I nodded and said something neutral like, "If that's how you feel, I guess we should figure out the next steps. She looked surprised that I wasn't arguing or begging her to stay, but I didn't care. My focus had already shifted. I needed to know who or what was behind this sudden calculated shift in her behavior. This wasn't just her waking up one day and deciding she wanted out. This was something bigger, and I wasn't going to let it blindside me any more than it already had. After that conversation, she went into her own apartment, and by Monday, I got the divorce papers. And let me tell you, they weren't just about ending the relationship. They were about taking everything. Half the house, my savings, my investments, the car. She wanted all of it. Plus, some vague clause about spousal support that made no sense given her solid income. It was like she was swinging for the fences, expecting me to roll over and hand her everything I'd worked for. At first, I thought it was just her being vindictive, but the way she'd framed her demands, so detailed and aggressive, made me certain there was someone coaching her through this. So I started digging. It wasn't like I could just ask her who she'd been talking to, so I had to get creative. I started with her social media. She hadn't blocked me, and while she didn't post often, I went through her tagged photos and comments, looking for anyone new. That's when I noticed a pattern. Someone named Jake kept liking and commenting on her posts. Nothing inappropriate, just enough to make me pause. I clicked his profile, and it was public. He didn't seem like much at first glance, a guy in his 30s who worked in marketing, judging by his bio. But as I scrolled through his feed, I noticed something strange. He'd posted a photo at the same cafe I'd seen her at weeks ago. On the same day, I overheard her talking about starting fresh. My stomach churned as I kept scrolling. There were more subtle hints. A comment on one of her posts saying, "You've got this." A selfie he'd posted from what looked like her new apartment. None of it was concrete proof, but it was enough to make me suspicious. I wasn't sure what to do with this information, but I knew I couldn't just sit there and wait for answers to fall into my lap. Her mention of a friend helping her through things had stuck with me, and I needed to know who it was. I decided to call one of our mutual friends, Lisa. She and my wife had been close for years, so if anyone knew what was going on, it would be her. I kept the conversation casual at first, just asking if she'd talked to my wife recently or if anything seemed off. Lisa responded quickly, saying she didn't know anything about a friend or any advice. I asked a few more questions, trying to probe, but she shut down the conversation defensively, saying she really couldn't help me. The whole thing felt rushed, like she was trying to avoid getting involved. Not ready to give up, I called another friend, Emily. I went through the same routine, explaining that I was just trying to make sense of everything. At first, she seemed hesitant, dodging my questions with vague answers. When I pressed her a bit more, she ended the call abruptly, leaving me more suspicious than ever. I sat there, frustrated, trying to figure out what my next move should be. Then, to my surprise, Emily called me back. She told me she needed to make sure whatever she said wouldn't get back to her. I promised it wouldn't, and after a long pause, she finally told me what she knew. Apparently, my wife had been spending a lot of time with someone named Jake, someone she'd met through work. Emily said she didn't know much else, but from what she'd heard, Jake was deeply involved in the advice my wife was getting about the divorce. Hearing that name felt like a piece of the puzzle clicking into place. Now it was clear. This wasn't just about her needing space or finding herself. Someone else was in the picture, steering her decisions, and I was determined to find out why. I decided to confront it in my own way. That weekend, I drove to her apartment building and parked a block away, hoping to confirm what I already knew. Sure enough, a couple of hours later, she walked out of the building with Jake. They didn't hold hands or anything, but the way they walked together, close, leaning in to talk, was enough. They got into his car and drove off, leaving me sitting there, staring at the space where they'd been. I didn't follow them. I didn't need to. At that moment, it was clear. She hadn't just fallen out of love with me. She'd been planning her exit with someone else. And now it all made sense. The sudden distance, the financial questions, the aggressive demands in the divorce papers. She wasn't just leaving me. She was leaving me with nothing. And she had someone backing her every step of the way. I went home that night, my mind spinning with everything I'd learned. The betrayal stung, but what hurt more was how calculated it all was. She was using the divorce as a stepping stone for whatever life she was building with Jake, but she had no idea what I'd prepared for her. The first mediation session was tense. From the moment we walked in, her lawyer showed up with a folder so thick it looked like they were filing a lawsuit against a Fortune 500 company. He started going through her demands like they were completely reasonable. Half the house, the savings, my investments, the car, even some additional nonsense about spousal support. I stayed quiet, pretending to listen, but I was waiting for my lawyer to make his move. When it was finally our turn, he calmly slid a stack of documents across the table and said, "Before we proceed, I think it's important for everyone to review these." Her lawyer picked up the papers, skimming through them. His confident demeanor shifted quickly as he flipped the pages, his brows furrowing deeper with each one. "What is this?" he asked, looking up. "These documents show the transfer of all major assets into a trust under my client's mother's name," my lawyer explained, his voice steady. "The transfers were completed several weeks before the divorce filing, and the trust is fully legal and irrevocable." The room went completely silent. Her lawyer turned to her, his confusion now mixed with frustration. "You didn't mention this," he said flatly. She snatched the papers from his hands and flipped through them, her face turning red. "This can't be real," she muttered, staring at the notarized signatures and dates. Then she turned to me, her expression shifting from disbelief to fury. "You planned this," she hissed, glaring at me like I'd committed some unforgivable crime. "You knew I was going to file, and you set this up to screw me over." I didn't respond. I just sat there, letting her connect the dots on her own. Her lawyer, now visibly annoyed, asked my lawyer to explain further. So he did, calmly, methodically, and with every piece of proof needed to make the transfers ironclad. The dates lined up perfectly, showing I'd moved everything well before she filed. The signatures were properly notarized and the trust was airtight. There was nothing they could do to contest it. She was livid. "You're unbelievable," she snapped, leaning forward in her chair. "I can't believe you'd do something like this to me." I still didn't say a word. What was there to say? This wasn't about me doing something to her. This was about protecting myself, because she'd made it clear she wasn't leaving quietly. The meeting ended with her lawyer muttering something about needing to reassess their approach, but it was obvious to everyone in the room that they had no moves left to make. When we walked out of the building, she pulled me aside in the hallway, her face a mix of anger and desperation. "This isn't over," she said, her voice low. "You're going to regret this." I just looked at her and said, "I already regret trusting you. That's the only regret I have." After that mediation session, things spiraled faster than I expected. She went into full meltdown mode almost immediately. It started with the calls. Endless calls. At first she sounded calm, even apologetic, leaving voicemails that started with, "I think we just need to talk," or "I know this got messy, but we can fix it." When I didn't respond, the tone shifted. By the second day, her messages were bouncing between sobbing and screaming. One voicemail would be her crying about how she made a mistake. The next would be an angry tirade, accusing me of being stingy and vindictive, blaming me for everything going wrong in her life. I ignored it all. My lawyer had advised me not to engage, and honestly, I didn't want to. I was done playing her games. But she wasn't. When the calls and texts didn't work, she started spinning stories. I started hearing from mutual friends that she'd been telling people the divorce wasn't real, that it had all been some elaborate prank. A prank? I mean, who would even believe that? It didn't take long for the cracks in her story to show. Friends started asking questions like, if it was a prank, why did you file actual legal paperwork? Or why hire a lawyer and make such specific demands if it wasn't serious? When people didn't immediately buy into the prank excuse, she doubled down. She claimed it wasn't just a joke, but a way to test the strength of our relationship. She started painting herself as the victim, saying she was hurt and betrayed by my reaction, that I'd taken things too far and destroyed the trust in our marriage. At first, some people seemed to buy into her stories. I'd get these weird texts or comments from acquaintances saying things like, "Wow, I didn't realize things were so rough for her." Even her brother lashed out, saying, "You should have just talked it out instead of being so drastic." And it was frustrating, but I knew the truth would come out eventually, and it did, thanks to one of our mutual friends. Let's call him Matt. Matt and I weren't super close, but we'd always been friendly. A couple of weeks after the mediation, he messaged me out of the blue, saying he had something I needed to see. When we met up, he pulled out his phone and showed me a string of texts between her and Jake. I was confused at first. "How did you even get these?" I asked, scrolling through the messages. Matt explained that he had a mutual friend with Jake, someone who had been privy to their conversations. Apparently, this mutual friend had started feeling uneasy about how things were playing out, especially when Jake began bragging about how he was helping her secure her future. It didn't take long for that mutual friend to connect the dots and realize what securing her future actually meant. Trying to bleed me dry. Feeling guilty about staying silent, the friend took screenshots of the texts and shared them with Matt, knowing he had a better relationship with me and might be able to warn me. "This guy's been playing both sides," Matt said, shaking his head. "He's been hyping her up to take you for everything while making her believe he'd be there for her afterward." Matt handed me the texts and said, "I thought you should know. You don't deserve this, man." The texts were brutal. She wasn't just venting to Jake about the divorce. She was actively planning her next moves with him, and he was coaching her through it. One of the messages from her said, "Once the settlement's done, we'll have everything we need. I just need him to agree to the terms." Jake's reply, "Don't back down. Make him feel guilty if you have to. He owes you. We'll start fresh once you've got the money." I sat there staring at Matt's phone, trying to process what I was reading. This wasn't a misunderstanding or some emotional reaction to a failing marriage. This was cold, calculated manipulation. I thanked Matt and he left, but my mind was spinning. Everything made sense now. Her sudden distance, her obsession with our finances, her aggressive demands in the divorce. It had all been part of a plan. One she'd been working on with Jake behind the scenes. The text spread quickly among our mutual friends. Matt shared them with a few people, and from there, they made the rounds. Suddenly, her narrative wasn't holding up anymore. People who'd been neutral or even supportive of her started pulling away, and the shift was almost instant. The people who had been defending her or staying on the fence now saw her for who she really was. Even her closest allies started distancing themselves. By the time the divorce was finalized, she had nothing but her personal belongings. Her lawyer quietly dropped her case after realizing there wasn't a legal leg to stand on. All those bold demands had crumbled under the weight of the paperwork I'd prepared, and the trust I'd set up with my mom was untouchable. As for Jake, he seemed to vanish the moment things started unraveling. I wouldn't be surprised if he'd been using her just as much as she'd been using me. From what I could piece together, he'd been feeding her delusions of independence and a fresh start, but the second it became clear she wasn't walking away with anything, he was gone. Without Jake in her corner, her confidence took a nosedive. The calls and texts kept coming, but now they were more desperate. She wasn't accusing me anymore, she was begging. "Can we just talk? Please, I'll do anything to fix this," one voicemail said. Another, "You don't have to forgive me, but can't we just settle this and move on? I'll drop everything if you just talk to me." I didn't respond. I couldn't. The damage was done, and there was no coming back from it. Even her family started to pull away. Her brother reached out to me at one point, apologizing for some of the things he'd said earlier when he believed her side of the story. "I didn't know what she was doing to you," he admitted. "I'm sorry I ever took her word for it." As for me, I got the house, my savings, and something I hadn't felt in a long time, peace of mind. My mom, as always, was my rock. She came over with buckets of paint and a list of ideas to help me reclaim the space as my own. Now, life feels like it's finally mine again. No more second-guessing every little interaction. No more feeling betrayed. Just peace. She's a chapter in my past, one I don't reread anymore. And as far as I'm concerned, the rest of the story is entirely mine to write.